So my upbringing, everything about my life up until this point, what you're looking at is the 52-year-old version of Nikki, but everything about the lens through which I see the world, how I lead, how I practice in this work, how I parent, how I show up as a spouse, is absolutely informed by my upbringing. So I'm the only child born to two incredibly potent academics. Both of my parents are college professors, and they both were fairly violently involved in the civil rights movement.
Wow.
My mom less so than my dad. But growing up, that's what I heard so much about: consternation and strife and clawing their way to a sense of mattering and wanting to be a part of their home, their country, and be fully ingratiated, fully folding into the fullness of the American dream, and how elusive that is just for Black folk. And so that was what I heard my entire life. On top of that, I grew up, with the exception of the time that I was here in Chicago, for the most part on historically Black college campuses. My parents taught primarily, not exclusively, at HBCUs. Though I was in Chicago for a little bit of time, I regard myself as being from Hampton, Virginia. My parents taught, okay, ain't you? All right, my parents taught at Hampton. I grew up on Hampton's campus after elementary school, so middle school, high school, college. And so that's like all of this understanding about the rich tapestry of the Black experience is who I am, not just what I do. So that's all a part of how I think about this work.
Well, I love that. And you mentioned your grandmother and your parents and how they were trailblazers. What other lessons have you learned from them, and how else has that influenced you as you moved on through life?
I mean, for like most of us, right? When we think about, if we really spend time to think about, so what did we learn from our parents? Not the stuff and thing of it. It's more the belief system around who we are at our core, like the marrow of me. And so what I learned is how loud and noisy and thick and opaque narratives are. And particularly those narratives that are assigned to Black and brown, not exclusively. I mean, women get the narrative, men get the narrative, veterans get the narrative, LGBT, right? So we all have a narrative that comes with our life, and it is inside of that narrative that we have to figure out how to exist. And I remember one of the things that my grandmothers would tell me. My company, by the way, is named in honor of both of my grandmothers. And both of them were just like super involved in what they called at their time Negro rights initiatives. But my grandmother, my mother's mother, grew up in Jim Crow South, so she had a very different kind of almost beleaguered view of the plight of Black people, even in the midst of trying to work with NAACP and Negro whites. But my father's mother was from Ohio, and this woman was 6'2" and just not having it, right? She was just... No. So, but my mother's mother was very much, you fight for your rights to a point, and you can speak up for yourself to a point. I remember just one quick story.
No, take it.
Listen, we're gonna be
I'm
here all
loving
day.
it.
I don't even know how much time we have. Okay, so one quick story. So I graduated from law school at the University of Miami. I passed the bar the first time I took it, and we had a family reunion like days after I got the word that I passed the bar. So I went to my grandmother's house, and I ran in the house to say, "Grandmama, I passed the bar and I got a job with this law firm in South Florida." And she kind of, I just remember so vividly. She got up from her chair, very feeble-bodied old Black woman, if you could envision that, and she put both of her hands on my shoulders and she said, "Don't go up there and upset any white folks." Right? So her orientation around and being empowered, even in the midst of being proud of me and excited for me, there was something in there that knew very clearly that whatever I am, I'm still subject to the narrative, and I'm still subject to that brand. And there's some level of fragility that still has to be a part of, in her view. Upsetting white people could literally get you killed. Still can, right? So anyway, so that was part of what I understood, and part of the kind of things that she told me, and that's the stuff that helps me in my work. And quite frankly, sometimes it diminishes my ability to be as forthright in my backbone as I'd like to think that I am.
And in what ways do you think it diminishes you, or do you have examples on what you ran into, like what challenges you ran into in that way?
Well, I would tell you, my whole career, I even practiced law, then I did a lot of HR, then worked for the Fed. I can't say that there's ever been an environment where I felt entirely welcome in. In fact, the more loud message was the message that I know was coming to the narrative of Nikki and not to the Nikki of Nikki. And so what I saw, things like, messages around, oh, Nikki, you're too intimidating. I'm gonna ask Black women up in here. By show of hands, how many of you have been told you're intimidating in the workplace? Every last one of us, right? Having a point of view and having a Black mouth with it as a female is problematic in most corporate spaces, in spaces, period. So anyway, we get that feedback, and then you get you talk too much, you don't talk enough, or people don't like that you dress this way, or people don't understand what, so it's always kind of this, you're subject to someone else's perception of you in ways that you find that becomes the work, trying to figure out how to manage that versus the work of the work. So when I hear about that, and I remember experiencing so much of that, one employer in particular, it was just like, everything was, Nikki, you're wrong. Nikki, you're not good enough. Nikki, your messages are too this. Nikki, you're coming off as this. Nikki, why do you have your law degree up and you're doing HR? People don't like that. People don't like that you always wear suits to work and this is a casual. People don't like, so it's always you're not fitting in. And to the point where it's now like a part of, I'm subject to discipline. So, and then that's the corporal punishment equivalent in the workplace, right? And so I'd always think about, dang, there's my grandma's message again. There's my grandma's message again. And so I'd be lying if I suggested that some of that didn't make me paranoid. Like, because sometimes people give me some feedback that I, for daggone sure, need to hear. And I'm like, wait, was that because I'm Black or because I actually do need to shut up? Right.
I go through that every
I don't
day.
know. What was that? Right.
It's right there.
Right.
He can tell you that. He knows.
Right. So I mean, that's what I'm thinking. Like sometimes I feel like I overthink it a little bit because I'm just sensitive to it. But I also know that there's some truth in there.
Nikki, thank you for allowing me to go off script a little bit. It's just that you're really interesting, and I'm having a visceral response to some of the things you're saying. So this is really helpful. But you have an enormous amount of experience, 20 plus years in the private and public sector. How has that experience influenced your current understanding of racial inequity and disparities that still exist today?
So I had the opportunity to do a podcast with some of your team members earlier, and what I shared then is what I will share now, and that is because I've been such a student of work and how work works, and I understand that whatever it is a place that we all go to at some point in our lives, this thing called work, and that is true of most human beings, irrespective of where we live. And the workplace is tremendously powerful in that it can be the source of such joy and replenishment, but it could also be the source of diminution and muting and stunting that doesn't just contribute to the way that we work our work, but it contributes to how we feel about ourselves as human beings. So in my HR life, I was always really interested in employee engagement. We all love employee engagement. HR folks can't get enough of it. But there are circumstances that give rise to really rich and meaningful employment engagement experiences. And some of those include like to what extent can we come to work with our dignity intact, leave work with our dignity intact? Do we feel as though we are affirmed and valued and appreciated because of who we are and not in spite of it? How do we find progression in the workplace, progressive programs at work? Are we with an employer or with a manager who allows us to continue our education, who is in the business of sharpening our skills and developing us and finding ways for us to grow in our careers? Those kinds of things matter. And when they're in place, then you tend to be more interested in work, more connected to the workplace. You have a sense of safety and security, and now you become more engaged. And it is that engagement that we covet, but not for engagement's sake. We covet engagement because of what it activates. Engagement activates a discretionary effort and like all this great innovation, like you're like pouring into the workplace the best of all of your lived experiences. I sometimes am not quite sure how much of my lens, my Black female, 50-year-old something, mama, that kind of thing, how much of that is welcome into the conversation until I feel safe, right? But there's some circumstances that give rise to that safety. So when we are talking about like all of that I've learned in my career, it's the DEI, specifically racial equity work I do now, is really about how do humans engage toward one another? What recognition do we have about the default inertia that we all walk into? When we all came into this room, there was a narrative that came in with us, and there are definitions around that narrative that come in with us, and some of those narratives are more deficit rich than others, and that lends itself to an inertia, right? And so the DEI work fights within an inertia in every single environment. And part of why we want to push against that inertia, I mean, I got a whole litany of economic reasons why that is the case, from the federal macroeconomic policy, monetary policy theory kind of issues around that. But at the root of it is the engagement. Like, so what we say we want as employers, we work ourselves against by just not recognizing that the inertia in place in work almost always counteracts what we say we want, particularly for those that are coming in with these narratives. So, what'd you ask me?
You're answering everything. How has your experience impacted your understanding of racial equity and inclusion?
Okay.
Yeah, you're answering it beautifully, by the way.
That was pure happenstance. Okay.
So let's skip into the actual workplace.
Yeah.
So how has your experience helped you define or differentiate between what is racial equity and how do you distinguish between equity and equality in the workplace?
Okay, so I define racial equity as proportional fairness that takes into account the cultural and historic realities that have beset people of color as distinct from all other people and works to remedy the same. So there's three parts to this definition, the way that we define it in our work with Harper Slade. One is proportional fairness. So it's not fairness, it's proportional fairness. That is responding to what has happened to Black and brown people in this country, but you gotta know what happened before you can respond to it. Many of us don't. So that requires active effort to figure out what is your lived experience, by the way, right? What y'all do different on those Friday nights that we don't do? What your Thanksgiving dinner look like? All of that, like the cultural nuances that are very different and largely accommodative. Like Black and brown lived experiences almost have been built since 1619 in a way to try to accommodate how to carve out a life here. So what does that look like still even today? But it also remedies, right? So there's a remedial aspect. So I'm clear our definition freaks a lot of folks out because it feels affirmative action-y, it feels reparation-y, and it probably is. But what does that have to do with the workplace? So what we have been pursuing for years and years and years is equality, which is cool if we did it, right? And so it's almost like that ship has passed, sort of, just because of the urgency of the demography right now and what we're seeing with the economic realities that the Fed has studied en masse. I'm happy to share with any of you all any of the studies that have been recently promulgated over the last 2 years on the cost of inequity specific to race and racism. But there's like trillions of dollars that we have lost and continue to lose hourly because of the way that we have excluded Black and brown from the fulsome American dream. So there's that piece. So as I think about racial equity and why it has to be equity at this point and not equality, is because I'm really interested in the heart condition. I'm really interested in the belief system humans have one to another. I'm interested at some point, but what you're doing in the name of equity or equality or DEI, or what you're saying is not as compelling to me as who you're being. Because your being shows up in the way you parent. It shows up in the way that you show up in community. It shows up in how I experience you or how other people experience you in Kroger. Or wait, y'all got Kroger here? Yeah, you do have, yeah, grocery store. Right, so it's, oh, that's right. So it's just like your being is very, very different, and that's what I'm super interested in. It's the harder work, but it's the work that helps to reset, finally, how humans engage with one another in affirmation of our beauty and tapestry and not in spite of it. So in other words, I can see my white brothers and sisters and see value and potency in your beauty and in your value without trying to make you be me. trying to find a way for you to be familiar to me, trying to make, okay, what, do you eat collard greens? Do you eat this? Like, do y'all like to watch these kind of, like, you don't have to have all of that for me to see you as valuable. And yet we still, like, we're in this thing where we make people audition for value,
Jesus.
right? Like, as a whole human construct, you have to audition for value. So anyway, that's why equality like doesn't really work for me anymore. We've never really been good at it. We don't know how to do it, and all that really is beating away the manifestation of the thing. So if you don't like Hispanic people, then equality says, well, here's what, even if you don't like them, here's what you can't do because you don't like them. So we beat away the doing of the thing, and we never deal with, why don't you like Hispanic people? Like we're like, let's deal with that.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. You know, something else I would love to hear from you about is, so Harper Slade actually helps organization address racial inequalities. Could you explain or deepen or further explain your philosophy and how that has informed how you work with individuals and organizations to deepen their journey around addressing racial inequality?
Yep. Well, first it's an equity, so I don't really talk about equality that much. But to your point, what I do is try to help organizations cultivate environments for Black and brown talent to thrive. First, before we talk about recruiting strategies, or before we talk about what programs, what your policy statement's gonna be, I really wanna unpack, especially at the leadership level, what is already here culturally, what social norms are already here that are gonna thwart even the most sincere efforts to move DEI forward. It requires that employers recognize that most environments are already inhospitable for difference. And that's because the world is inhospitable to difference. So what I've said differently, when you think about the D, the E, the I, as a matter of course, we've never really included difference default. Like, right? When I talk about you got to audition for it, like I matter contextually, I matter more because I got a law degree or because I work for the Fed or because of, but it still is a Black, whatever. So the mattering becomes so consequential in terms of how we find our way toward just the human ritual of living. So I think for me, it's the pacing and sequencing of the work, like the D work and the I work and the E work. It is helping employers understand that whatever is already there, we all inherited this environment that requires almost this presumption of muting and a diminishment of difference, because that's all we've known since we've had to figure out how to navigate difference since the dawn of time in our country. That's all we've known is exclusion and those kinds of ideals. And so while we'd like to think that we're better, because everything about our doctrines say that we are, everything about the Constitution, everything about the Bill of Rights, everything about all of wonderful amendments and all of these laws, the voter rights and civil rights, all those things say we are who we in fact are not. And that is always true of every workplace. I hate to say that, like, it's not to bemoan or besmirch any of you in your work, because I know that you're earnest and committed. You wouldn't be here otherwise, but you're still fighting inside of an organization. DEI exists inside of organizations designed to kill it. And that's just because you exist within the United States, and the United States doesn't understand difference as a matter of presumptive value. They just don't. We just don't. And being able to say that, that's what I talk to employers about, because they're like, girl, get on out of here. Like, it's so offensive. People get so mad at me, but I think we want to be able to say these words. We got to say it out loud, because it's hard to cure something that you can't even call out, right? If I'm in total denial that I have cancer, I'm never going to go to chemo.
Yeah.
So that's it.
I was about to give you an offering. Like, this is getting good. Jeez, Lord have mercy. But, so just allow me just to ask you this question, a little bit off script, but I am really interested in hearing your perspective on this. You talked about auditioning for value, which is powerful, and I've seen that before and been through it. What is the impact on the individual that has to audition for value? What have you seen? Like, have behaviors popped up from that? Or what is the negative impact of an individual that has to go through that experience?
Oh, well, I mean, I think we all know that there's nothing positive really that comes out of that. There's living a life of accommodating someone else's perception of you every single day and every single way is not just exhausting, but it is joy depleting. And I mean, it's just hard. It erodes, I think, your psychological well-being, your emotional well-being. It fragments families. It's just difficult. And in spite of that, many of us who live under the weight of these deficit-rich narratives that are just stuck to us, you're expected to perform and produce and be excellent and effervescent and never frown and never be upset and always be on.
Yeah.
And what I have found, especially in the environments where I have been my most depleted, in ways that I knew was like based on not just the regular work depletion stuff, but just like the race stuff, it definitely impacted my marriage.
Wow.
Impact the way that I parent, my patience level, my, how much Prozac I'm sucking back. Really. So, I mean, there's a lot that we don't really understand about what the toll, especially the cumulative toll. And this is, by the way, not just specific to Black folks. It's just anybody who has just been in the place of more often than not, and sometimes people don't even want to hear you say it, but you're battling against this narrative that's in this room with you. But there's this weight that has this cumulative effect, especially generationally. Yeah. If you think about, I don't know how many watch National Geographic and you see, I'm going to butcher this, but like animals that are born into the wild, you see that some animals literally come out of their mother's womb immediately running, right? They don't know what the heck's going on, but it's something ain't right. So they come out and they're just like, mama's running, so we running. That's passed on trauma. And I think many of us have that, especially descendants of slaves, have, if I don't know what the technical terms in our corpuscle, this something inside of our bodies, it is passed on this sense of trauma, and it is really, really hard. Last point on this, there's so many times where I have gone to work. I think I've posted something on this LinkedIn, but there's so many times I have gone to work on a Monday following a public murder of fill in the blank. Philando Castile, Mike Brown, certainly George Floyd, Brown Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin.
Yep. No problem. So thank you so much for sharing that. Do we need a break? Okay. So isn't this conversation really, really good so far? I'm just really enjoying the conversation.
I was wondering how long it's going to fall apart, how long it's going to take before I just completely fell out this chair.
You had me at the
anyway,
first
but let me finish my point. So I'm sorry. So yeah, so that what you just saw me do typically has no place in the workplace. So Monday morning meetings, I'm in the meetings and staff meetings, and particularly with a lot of our leaders, and it's like, so what'd you do this weekend? What'd you do this weekend? And I went yachting, I went skating, I went, a dinner party, and I'm falling apart. In the midst of all of my Blackness falling apart, and I'm worried, how did you guys not see that? Did you guys not know? Did you guys not, how? And so there's a piece of it that's how do you deal with your own feelings about it, and then deal with the fact that nobody really seems to care. It was not even an issue that was worthy of coming up in larger environments. So two kind of daggers, if you will, and you still got to produce.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Nikki.
Thank you for making me cry.
Just promise that wasn't my goal, but I just appreciate the transparency and helping us walk through this. And just two more questions. When we think about businesses and how they probably need to reform or re-envision how they go about addressing racial inequality inside of their organization, how can these organizations begin to look through an equity lens when it comes to their own systems, processes, including recruitment, performance management, team collaboration, training and development? What are some of the best practices and strategies that you would share with us?
So for me, everything starts with like a belief system again. So I think it's important for employers to first presume that your systems and your policies and your structures, your culture probably does not contemplate cultivate the best environment for multiculturalism, for equity, certainly equality or equity. So what I'd love to see are companies that are willing to start this journey with interrogating every single one of their employee policies. So it's like, hey, HR, let's sit in a conference room and we're gonna go just start with one day and we're gonna go through every part of our employee life cycle, how people come in, what happens while they're here, and how they exit. And I need to understand that from the lived experience of Black and brown people first. And the reason why I start there is because I got like the economic arguments around that and browning of the country, and there's economic implications around us not getting that right quicker. But then all of the other marginalized group, I'm going to assume as an employer that the experience that employees have is far more complex than I know. I'm going to assume that the employee engagement surveys that we've been promulgating for years that tell us something will never tell us what it's like to have a darker skin and that narrative and try to maneuver our workplace. I'm just going to assume that and interrogate our policies with that thought in mind, interrogate our programs and our cultures with that thought in mind, and ask questions. Solicit feedback, find ways to engage with companies like mine who do racial equity assessment audits. We call it the Racial Equity Index, right? But it is designed to help you understand what is the Black and brown lived experience here. But you can't get to that question if you're not willing to presume that, wow, is it different? Maybe it is different. Yeah. So I think that's like the first step. What we're used to doing in most corporate environments, because we're like super A type personalities and everybody's got a bias toward action. We try to figure out, what are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to hire? Where are we supposed to go? What do we need to throw up on the website, right? That's good. And even if you're sincere, it's not effectual. Mm-hmm. It's not effectual in terms of changing the tide that now must be turned around in order for our country to thrive.
Thank you for that, Nikki. And last question. So what guidance would you give to ERGs and their allies as they continue this important work and try to really build momentum around change?
Yeah, I don't know if any of you have ERGs in your workplace, but I find them to be incredibly important if constructed and accessed and leveraged appropriately and resourced right. So employee resource groups, right? So I've come from environments most recently with the Federal Reserve, and I'm so proud of the work of the Fed after 2020. So I work for the St. Louis Bank, St. Louis Fed, and they had 3 branches, one in Louisville, one in Little Rock, one in Memphis. I ran the Louisville office. But in this time, the 7 years that I worked for the Fed, we had 2 glaring murders of Black people by police officers that the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis stepped back and said, okay, wait, hold on, we're missing something, and our employees are falling apart here, our Black employees in particular, and it's not showing up in our employee survey in the way that we understand it. So inside, of course, St. Louis, so you had Mike Brown, and then you had Breonna Taylor in that time frame. And so to their credit, they embarked on exactly what I just talked about, which is this racial equity assessment, racial equity index, and they were like, we really want to understand Black lived experience here first, not exclusively, but first. And in doing so, they invoked the ERG, the Black employee ERG, to help assure that the questions that we're asking were right, that we're picking the right consultant, that we're orienting this and socializing this in a way that felt right and appropriate inside of the organization. Each of those ERG members, and I'm talking about, you have folks like an analyst this, specialist that, mid-level manager this, who were assigned now an advisor. Right, you become my coach. So I got a coach who's a specialist. Who's a Black. We had a specialist in our IT department was the Black lived experience coach to the president of our bank, the president of the Federal Reserve. Had this 17 layers down, weekly meeting with, so what am I missing with Black employees? Like, totally, tell me, where am I going wrong? That kind of visibility and vulnerability. But you have to have some level of credibility with your ERG to get to that point. And, ERGs go through their own maturation phase. And so I think it's important for them to really think about how do we do the best that we can in celebrating who we are and educating on who we are, and then advocating about when and where we need help and need to have greater visibility.
Nikki, I have to say that, number one, I'm humbled to be able to share this time with you. And on behalf of Proscolas, ITSMF, our primary partner, Tech Systems, we just thank you for bringing all of who you are here. You are a brilliant, masterful mind and a beautiful soul. Thank you. Let's